Welcome to the lecture on the second half of Chapter 8 for Psychology 150. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about the concept of intelligence, which has been used and misused for well over 100 years. There are many different characteristics, qualities, abilities that people label as intelligence. And there seems to be a general sense of intelligence, a general factor, if you will, that explains multiple types of what we define as intelligence. So, sort of a rough definition of intelligence is this ability we have to reason and solve problems and make sense of things, to understand complexity, and to adapt in light of the changes in the environment. And all of the people pictured here have some abilities that we might associate with the idea of intelligence. The idea really goes back to a problem in the French school system in the early 1900s. The French Ministry of Education had a difficulty. In their system, everybody is supposed to reach the same level of knowledge and ability. And children who needed more help get extra tutoring. But what they had been doing was letting the teachers decide which of the students was in need of extra help. And this was not very objective. So they hired Alfred Binet to develop a test of knowledge that children at various ages would, on average, seem to know. Now, Binet was quite clear that his test was not a measure of some innate ability, even though it's certainly come to be used in that way. He developed a test that measured the average amount children at different ages should know by giving the test to thousands and thousands of children to see what the average score was. And the amount of information that a 6-year-old, say, should know is defined as a mental age of 6. So a mental age is your cognitive functioning compared to the average child at that age. This later came to be developed into something called the intelligence quotient, or IQ, which was computed by taking the mental age the child earned and dividing by their chronological actual age, and then multiplying that by 100 to get rid of the decimal points. So, for example, if a child had a mental age of 6, but their chronological age was 4, that would be 6 divided by 4, which is 1.5, and you multiply that by 100, and it's an IQ of 150. Now, this method doesn't work once you get past the lower ages. Certainly someone who has a mental age of 80 and who is actually 40 does not have an IQ of 200. So for adults, they use a slightly different system where the scores are plotted along a normal curve. The first person to come up with the idea of a general intelligence was the statistician Charles Spearman. He argued that there are multiple skills that all rely on sort of a general ability to think and reason and learn. He also argued that there were specific intelligences as well. Another kind of differentiation was first proposed by the psychologist Raymond Cattell, who distinguished between fluid and crystallized intelligences. Fluid intelligence is the ability to learn new things, to process information rapidly. And this is something that sort of peaks in the early 20s and declines thereafter. Crystallized intelligence is the accumulated knowledge that a person has, so that they're able to solve problems because they already know some of the answers. And so these two tend to be in tension. Fluid intelligence declines with age in adults. Crystallized intelligence increases, and they balance each other out until, on average, about the mid-70s, after which there's, for most people, for the average person, there is a decline in cognitive functioning. The Harvard psychologist Howard Gardner has argued that we should extend the concept of intelligence to include multiple kinds of abilities. In essence, any kind of ability that anybody has, he calls an intelligence. He's certainly been very successful with that idea. I think it kind of increases the term intelligence to include all abilities, so that I'm not sure why you need a separate term for ability, why you need to call that intelligence. That seems superfluous. Robert Sternberg, who at the time was at Yale, developed a triarchic theory of intelligence. There's analytical intelligence, which is kind of the stuff that standard IQ tests measure. Defining words, solving problems, doing math, defining words. There's creative intelligence, which is the ability to come up with novel ideas. Then there's practical intelligence, what you might call street smarts, the ability to find a parking space, or to navigate your way across town, or to change a tire. All of those are practical intelligences. A number of psychologists, including most prominently Dan Goleman, have suggested that there's an intelligence around emotional skills. Emotional intelligence is this ability to understand and manage your emotional content, to understand other people's emotions, and thus to modify your behavior in response to those in appropriate ways. So it's an understanding both of your own and other people's emotions, and being able to use that information to navigate social relationships. So we can kind of summarize these as general intelligence, which is this thing that's measured by the total IQ score. Fluid and crystallized intelligences. Multiple intelligences. The three triarchic intelligences. And emotional intelligence. Behavioral genetics is the study of how human behavior is influenced by variations in the frequency of alleles in the human population. Alleles are just different forms of the same gene. And this can only tell you how much of the difference within a given group is due to genetics, not what genetics contributes to any one individual's behavior. So when we look at genetic studies, what we're saying is, if, let's say, identical twins have twice the similarity in their IQ scores as fraternal twins. That suggests that 50% of the variance is due to genetics. That doesn't mean that any one individual's IQ is determined 50% by genes. It means that across the whole population studied, 50% of the differences among all those people are due to genetic variations, and 50% are due to environmental influences. And 50% is roughly the amount of genetic influence you find for intelligence test scores, among another of other characteristics. Environmental factors, of course, have a huge impact on how well you do on these tests. Nutrition has a big impact, both prenatal nutrition of the mother and nutrition that you have after you're born. It makes a huge difference in brain development if you have proper nutrition. Various teratogens we talked about in Chapter 4, teratogens being substances that can affect fetal development, and any number of teratogens, including drugs and alcohol, heavy metals, radiation, etc., can affect the development of the brain and other organ systems. The family you grow up in. Does your family have resources to get you stimulating intellectual materials? Can your family send you to a good school? Is your neighborhood safe? Is there lead in the paint in your house? Does your family value education, or do they find it kind of, whatever? So all of those things influence how well you develop the skills that we use to do well on intelligence tests. Another important environmental factor is the birth weight. Children who are small for date or low birth weight tend to have lower average IQ scores than children who are born later when they are larger, up to a point. So how do we measure this thing that we call intelligence? One thing to think about when determining whether a test is useful is the distinction between reliability and validity. Reliability refers to how consistently the test gives you the same answer. So an IQ test that was reliable would give you a similar IQ score for the same person each time they took the test, barring any kind of change in their brain functioning. Validity is how well does the test measure what it's supposed to measure. So for example, if I had a scale in my bathroom that told me I weighed 100 pounds every day, it would be perfectly reliable, but it would not be valid because I do not weigh 100 pounds. We can also distinguish between achievement and aptitude tests. Achievement tests measure what you have learned. Aptitude tests measure or attempt to measure what you can learn, your ability to do something. Obviously, the second one of these is more difficult. It's fairly easy to measure what people have learned, but to be able to predict what they're going to be able to learn, that's a little bit more tricky. As I mentioned before, Alfred Binet developed the original scale in 1904. Louis Terman at Stanford adapted Binet's test and called it the Stanford-Binet test. In 1919, Terman actually also began a project where he tested some children and took a group of them who had scored very high on the test and followed them over time to see how well they did in life. Obviously, they outlived him by far. I think the last of these kids died a couple decades ago, but they were known as termites. And in fact, not surprisingly, people who have high IQs tend to do well in life. The big change in intelligence testing came about with the work of David Weschler, a psychologist at Bellevue Hospital in New York, who developed the, it was originally called the Weschler-Bellevue test, and then later the Weschler Adult Intelligence Scale. And it is for adults, and it actually divided intelligence into two types: verbal or language-based intelligence, and then performance or non-linguistic skills. Because adults don't gain more and more information universally across time as they get older, as I mentioned before, the idea of mental and age as a basis for IQ doesn't work past a certain age. And so what's used with adults is what you see on the bottom here. The scores are set so that they are normally distributed. This standardized normal curve here. The average IQ score is set at 100. And then, about 2/3 of people score somewhere between 85 and 115. So that's the average or typical score. I mentioned before validity and reliability. You have to have both of these in order for the test to be very useful. If you have a test which is not reliable, then it's not useful at all because you're getting different scores all the time. But you can have really great reliability and the test may be invalid for the purpose that you're using it for. One example is a test that's sometimes given to people applying to graduate school called the Miller Analogies test, which, as the name implies, measures your ability to interpret analogies. One of the many problems with intelligence tests is that they assume an underlying level of knowledge. They are, to some extent, achievement tests as much as they are aptitude tests. And so it's difficult for people who were not raised in the culture that the test is based on to have the test measure accurately their abilities and performance. And so there have been a number of attempts to get culturally less biased tests. It's probably impossible to eliminate altogether cultural bias, but less biased tests would be things like the items we see on the right here, where you have to figure out what's the missing shape in the sequence. And you can see that there are 3 of each color, and the one red one that's missing is the red triangle. One aspect of that intelligence tests measure is speed of processing. In general, people who process information faster are also able to process more complex information, and as such, their IQ test scores go up. Working memory is also involved in intelligence. Being able to manipulate information in your head is an important skill, and there's a fairly strong correlation between people's working memory capacity and their ability to do the kinds of items that we see on intelligence tests. There are some people whose overall IQ scores are fairly low, and yet have these, quote, islands of ability, unquote. These are people who can do something incredibly well, that one activity, but have difficulty with other kinds of activities. Stephen Wiltshire is a young man who's able to draw from memory incredibly detailed drawings, even though he has difficulty functioning in daily life. Kim Peek, who was the inspiration for the movie Rain Man, is another savant. He was able to remember incredible amounts of detailed information, but had real difficulty navigating social situations. One of the real sad chapters in psychology history happened in the 1970s, the work of a man named Arthur Jensen, who argued that there were genetically based racial differences in intelligence and that these couldn't be changed. And we don't really have time to go into detail the problems with that argument, but to suffice it to say, it's been thoroughly discredited, and he was pretty quickly torn apart. One of the main problems that incredible oversights that Jensen made was he didn't factor in the fact that while there are differences between people of different racial backgrounds in terms of appearance, there are also differences in the way they're treated in every society. So the environmental effects have, as we know, about half the difference in IQ scores. And there are clearly different environments for people who are in the dominant, powerful group in a society and members of other groups. Another factor is the idea of stereotype threat. This is an idea developed by Claude Steele at Stanford. What he found is that if you're given a test that you're told is designed to measure something that stereotypically your group does not do well at, it increases anxiety to the point where people don't do as well. So he did a couple of these things. He actually started out looking at gender differences. He looked at male and female students at Stanford. All students at Stanford are probably pretty bright. And he told them there was a test of analytical reasoning, I think. And the male and female students did equally well. He took another group of male and female students and told them the test was a test of math ability, and the male students did better, even though it's the exact same test. So there's this stereotype that women don't do as well in math as men do, and that causes anxiety. The same thing with black and white students with the test, the same test again. One group is told this is a test that diagnoses your ability to do well in school. And then a separate group is told that the test is not diagnostic. And you can see that when people are not worried about the stereotype, their performance is identical. But when there's a stereotype, it impairs people's ability in the minority group with being able to perform because on the test, because anxiety impairs memory. Thank you very much, and I will see you on Thursday.